Hi, everyone. Welcome to the lecture for this week. I want to apologize for taking so long to get it up. I was feeling a little bit under the weather earlier in this week and decided to get tested for COVID just as a precaution since they're offering it on campus. Everything came out negative, so we're all good, but that's why I'm getting a little bit of a late start on this. But for this week, I wanted to go over just a few things that I thought I really wanted to focus in on from each of the readings. So let's go ahead and get started. This first section is addressing the gender gap in sports leadership. And so the book gives a few suggestions for women and those who identify as women that essentially, like, here are some things that you should try to do to put yourself in the best possible position to succeed and to find opportunities, right? It's essentially that saying of where talent and hard work meets opportunity. And these are some other things that you can do to try to get there, right? They talk about getting an education in sports management or business related area, get involved in network activities, build networks, get involved with national organizations, gain knowledge with national organizations, be willing to self-promote, and get a mentor. Those are all really important things that you can do. However, I think it's still important to address the fact that there are still going to be obstacles, right? You could do all of these things, you can create all of these networks, but it's difficult just in general. When you look at almost any industry, some of the barriers that women have to face that men don't, right? And so the authors get into this here, right? There's stereotypes, there's structural forces, there's personal characteristics, and then for women of color, there's this double jeopardy where you're both a woman and a person of color. So it's to a certain degree held against you in both ways, right? And so while the book does a great job of talking about these different things that women can do, one of the most important things that people in leadership positions can do, specifically men, is be advocates, right? Create these opportunities and make sure that your organization is finding ways to have women in leadership, right? Making that a priority. And I know there's a lot of people that come in, and whether we're talking about race or we're talking about gender or we're talking about sexual orientation, there's always someone that comes up and says, well, shouldn't the best person for the job get the job? And that's right, but often that's not the case. There's a number of studies that have been done that prove that when someone leaves either their sex, their name, their gender, their race, some identifier off of their application, and people are just going based off of the merits of the individual, whether it's their education, their GPA, their experience, more often than not, women of color end up getting those positions, right? But a lot of folks, even if it's unknown bias, have those, and it prevents women from getting into these leadership positions, right? If you think about even with the WNBA, when we're talking about women of color, like, there are only 2 black coaches in the WNBA, despite the fact that a large majority of the players are black, and the 2 black coaches are men, right? Even though it's the WNBA. So I think it is important that, of course, women and those who identify as women find these opportunities and put themselves in the best possible positions. But I think it's really important for everyone in leadership positions in sports organizations to act as advocates, right? And do what they can to create these opportunities. It's really not that difficult if you make it part of your platform and just part of the way that your organization runs. Okay. Next, we're going to get into lingering issues in race and leadership. Right, I want to talk about the section of the book that talks about some of the deep-rooted barriers in sports, right? First, they talk about baseball. And they talk about this with regard to baseball, but and I hope you watched it, but in order to answer that discussion board question from a couple of weeks ago, that interview I did with Patrick Claybon, this idea and this ugly stereotype of black people and black athletes and black coaches, the fact that they are very athletic, but that they are not smart, really does play a role in the leadership positions that are being offered. And it's a sad truth. And I think the conversation that me and Patrick had when we were talking about the way that quarterbacks in the NFL are talked about, right? When they talk about the Tom Brady's and the Drew Breeses, they talk about their intelligence, they talk about their precision. And then when they go and start talking about Patrick Mahomes and Lamar Jackson, they talk about their athleticism, right? Even though they are still playing the same sport and oftentimes leading the league in yards and touchdowns. And it is an inherent bias for some folks to talk about black people in a way that only prioritizes their bodies and not their brains. And it leads to a problem. Like here where they're talking about baseball and some of the issues that they're having here. But I know Patrick and I talked about Eric Bieniemy, right? If you think about coaches like Doug Peterson or Matt Nagy, who worked with Andy Reid with the Kansas City Chiefs, each of them both got head coaching positions there afterwards. And then even I'm a Bengals fan, and they hired Zach Taylor, who only had an experience with the Rams as an assistant wide receivers coach in 2017, and then as the quarterbacks coach in 2018, and got a head coaching position before someone like Eric Bieniemy. Now, we're not in the interviews. We don't know exactly what's going on, but it does seem a bit odd that for a very long time, people were trying to poach coaches or assistant coaches from some of these folks that are kind of considered the new like Sean McVay or someone like Andy Reid, who's a little bit more established, but they're not giving someone like Eric Bieniemy a chance, right? So NFL's done some things. They have the Rooney Rule, where if there's a head coach opening, you have to interview a person of color. But even in our conversation, but even just what I've seen with Patrick on the side. There's a discussion of whether how legitimate is the Rooney Rule. There are some coaches now who are even avoiding or turning down interviews with when there's a head coaching opportunity because they know they're only being interviewed to satisfy that rule. So a lot of folks in the NFL are trying to figure out exactly what they could do to make the process better for everybody, right? And create these opportunities. But some of these numbers are pretty significant, right? So a 2012 report sanctioned by the NFL found that coaches of color are not getting second chances as head coaches, coordinators, or college head coaches. Between 1921 and 2017, only 21 black people had been hired out of over 400 NFL head coaching openings, and as of 2017, there have only been 3 Latino and no Native American or Asian head coaches in NFL history. Next, we'll get into the NBA, right? So the most racially diverse leadership positions out of any of the professional sports league. However, there is a trend of the percentages going down in terms of people of color being head coaches, right? So in 2012, there were more head coaches of color than white head coaches, but this trend was reversed in the past several years. In 2017, white head coaches held 70% of head coaching positions, whereas 74% of the players were black. And it's not just in these, because I know we consider, a lot of people look at sports like the NFL and the NBA and the WNBA, where the majority of the players are black, right? And trying to understand why that's the case, but there's not enough coaches or GMs, and particularly not enough owners who are black. But they're also just in general, like the idea that we're still kind of breaking ground on some of these things when it comes to race, right? Like just this week, Quentin Byfield, he was the number 2 pick in the NHL draft with the LA Kings, and that's the highest drafted any mixed race person has ever been drafted, right? So there's still, we're in 2020 and some of these things are still barely, progressing incrementally, but there are ways that a lot of these leagues are trying to make efforts to improve the opportunities for women, improve the opportunities for people of color. But even at the, we call it the amateur level with the NCAA, right? They have this idea of the black bottom pyramid, right? Where people of color, where it's evident for people of color is white Americans are disproportionately represented in more powerful leadership positions in intercollegiate sport. So recent NCAA reports show that black men and women hold approximately 10% of athletic director positions. Hispanic Latino men and women account for only 2%, and Asian and Native Americans have less than 1% combined representation at all 3 division levels in intercollegiate athletics. That's important to note because oftentimes it's almost like a trickle-down effect, right? So we look at these professional sports leagues, and the NCAA is just following suit. And you see a lot of coaches going back and forth between professional and amateur and into the collegiates, going back and forth between being an assistant coach, a head coach, failing out of being a head coach, going back down to being a head coach at the college level, or an assistant coach. And I think that was a stat that we were just talking about, where so many other white coaches are getting multiple opportunities despite having either equal or worse records than some of their black counterparts. And that's something that people need to be aware of. And lastly, we wanted to talk about leading athletes with disabilities. And in the section, they talk about some of the current issues for leaders in disability sport. So one is technology, right? Especially given that we're in 2020 and there's so many technological advances, it's important to think about what things that we can, what technologies, what equipment, what software, all these different things that we can implement to help those who are disabled, right? And whenever we think about a type of technology or equipment that can be used by athletes, not just by athletes with disabilities, these three questions are things that you should ask, right? Is the technology or equipment safe? Is the technology or equipment affordable? And is the use of the technology or equipment fair, right? All of those things to make sure that whoever wants or needs to use this will be able to have equal access to it. Some of the other issues, right? So a lack of media coverage. They go out and they discuss all these different ways that the Paralympics or even the Special Olympics do not get as much coverage or almost any coverage at all compared to the Olympics. Now, to a certain degree, that makes sense just in terms of the scale and the size of some of these events. But still, in a day and age where we have so many different channels and so many streaming networks, that not giving the opportunity to shed light on such an important organization and such an important event and such incredible athletes, I think it does a disservice to not just, that community, to their community, but to the sports community in general. Sponsorship. So I know they talk about large sponsorships for the IPC, but I think it's also important to note that a lot of the Paralympic and Special Olympic athletes can also have opportunities to find sponsorships if some of these organizations are looking for those opportunities, right? Now that there is a little bit, I know in recent years there has been some more coverage of the Paralympic Games and Special Olympics, but it's kind of like a mutually beneficial relationship, right? Where if you get more of these sponsors to sponsor not just the events, but sponsor the athletes, it would benefit them to get more coverage and do what they can to get more coverage for these events. So even if you're considering jumping right straight into a sports management or sports leadership position, you can also kind of get into it tangentially by getting involved with some other organization that looks for partnerships and looks for sponsorships and partnering up with organizations like that. And then we have inclusion, which I like this definition that they use, right? So the final stage of integration of people with disabilities in a sports competition or organization in which they are involved, accepted, and respected at all levels of the competition or the organization. And there's some things to consider when it comes to inclusion. One of the things when it comes to products that they're being built is universal design, right? So the concept of designing all products and the built environment to be aesthetic and usable to the greatest extent possible by everyone, regardless of their age, ability, or status in life, right? So the idea that whatever you're designing for people to use, whether it's Paralympics or Special Olympics, that whatever items or equipment that you are designing or whatever products that you're using, that everybody could use it equally, right? And then in terms of criteria for inclusion, right, they list a few of these, right? So of course we already talked about funding and sponsorships, media and information distribution, right? It would behoove multiple sports organizations to get involved and help bring a focus with the media on these events, right? Awards and recognition, when we talk about like the ESPYs, proper governance, proper philosophy, awareness and education at multiple levels, right? Making sure that the same way we educate our students and our kids in middle school and high school about the athletes that are pretty well known, that we're also bringing awareness and education to the Paralympic Games, to the Special Olympics, making sure we have events, programs, and advocacy, and of course proper management, right? That's the entire essence of this class. But for some reason, not always, I would say that there are some folks who always feel like they have to, when dealing with the disabled community, kind of holding them with kids' gloves, but in doing that, that protection they feel like they want to give to that community ends up being a barrier for recognition, for exposure, because they feel like there's a lot of folks that are worried they're going to do something wrong or say something wrong. Or there are some folks who are just lazy and don't want to have to deal with the logistics, right? Like we've seen so many. I mean, the fact that I know in the book they talked about like the U.S. has, you know, the ADA compliance, where there are some like Canada doesn't have like a countrywide ADA, where but you even see it here. Sorry, I was getting a little mixed up there, but I brought that up because even in the U.S. where we have ADA compliance requirements, there are so many businesses, whether small or large, that do what they can to either skirt the law or to do the very bare minimum to provide access, right? Even if you think about small things like the wheelchair accessibility when it comes to like public playgrounds, things like that. So there are a lot of folks who end up trying to avoid these things because they see it as a headache, or they want to be lazy, or they're trying to cut costs. And so when it comes down to it, management is a big part of letting all of it succeed. And going back to what we started with when we were talking about gender, advocacy. More than anything, when you're in a leadership position, and not just in sports, but just in general, when you're in a leadership position, part of being a leader is knowing when you need to speak up for other people when they're not at the table, right? People always end up talking about, I'm in the process of trying to get us a guest speaker for next week for our last week of class. And I've talked to her about this before. The idea that as a woman, she had to work really hard to get herself a seat at the table. Right, but that often can be a lot easier if you have someone in that room and at that table who's trying to save you a spot, or is trying to get you a spot, who's trying to get another chair into the room, right? And that's what your job should be, right? Regardless of your age, regardless of your sex, your gender, your sexual orientation, if you have made your way to the table, in my opinion, as your instructor, you should be doing what you can to add more seats to that table. So that's what I want to talk to you for this week. If you have any questions, please let me know. Email me. Your final paper is due at the end of next weekend. So please, I'm still dropping by my office hours. You can call me, text me, email me. And if you drop on my office hours, I'm on Skype you use the username art.utep@gmail.com.